Welcome to everyone. My name's Eric Meyer. I'm the Consul General here in Almaty. Kumbat, you were much more articulate, and you did a great job introducing Steven last week, and we're anxious to hear from him today. But for those who have not met Steven, Steven is a close friend of mine, and as you said so well last week, you're going to hear things today that you will not hear anywhere else. Steven Friedman is a polymath. This was acclaimed by the New Yorker magazine, and is an artist, philosopher. Today he's going to talk about education, and the New York Times acclaimed him as a genius philosopher. So it gives me great pleasure to reintroduce Steven Friedman today. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your time. It's late in the evening in Los Angeles, and we're grateful to have you today, and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. I want to thank the consulate in Almaty for arranging and facilitating these talks. I'd like to thank Kimbad, Tracy, Elmira, and again, I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I hope it's a good experience for everyone who participates. Last week, I presented an introduction, really, to the philosophy, or to philosophy broadly. I defined it as the limit of rigor, and I partly characterized rigor as being grounded in indifferences, in the sense that we exist in difference from everything else. It is our difference from everything else that constitutes our essential dignity. And it's also our difference from everything else that means that whatever applies to anyone else or anything else need not rigorously necessarily apply to us. And that includes everything. That includes the whole range of concepts. That includes even such seemingly trenchant features of experience as disease, old age, and death. If you want to imagine what kind of world would it be, what kind of world could we imagine in which death was not a necessary outcome, in which we did not necessarily die? That's this world, because we don't know the nature of future experience. The fact that people before us have experienced mortal outcomes, have died, doesn't mean that we have to experience the same fate simply because rigorously any difference between ourselves and anything else, everyone else, means that what applies to anything else or anyone else need not apply to us. So rigor and the type of representation of the world that rigor makes possible is what constitutes philosophy. It is all philosophy is trying to achieve, a set of propositions, a description of the world that's incontestable. Everything else is what I call heuristic. It's something that can be achieved by positing a goal and developing a set of elements that will help achieve that goal based upon past experience. One of the important things that we want to achieve from an educational standpoint is appreciating the nature of our circumstances, the nature of what presents itself to us incontestably, and is distinguished from what, in fact, may present to other individuals. Now, whenever I think about what I'm going to say for one of these talks, there's always some element of anxiety. And it's not because of stage fright or some, not being comfortable, speaking to people. What it is there are aspects of this encounter that are intrinsically unknown or unknowable. For example, I don't know all the personalities that might constitute the audience. I don't know the nature of each person's circumstance. I'm trying to achieve a communication that is effective for everybody present, everybody in an audience, and yet I don't know enough in detail about all the individuals and their circumstances to be able to reliably design a talk that will necessarily communicate effectively. There's a cousin of mine, a physician, very bright physician, who taught at UCLA, wrote books about men's health, and said consistently intelligent things to me. There was a period of time when I would see him once a week. We'd have lunch together and we'd have conversations. As an example of the type of remarks that he would make that were always useful in some way. Once we were talking about Van Gogh, and I mentioned that Van Gogh's art had failed Van Gogh in the sense that it didn't save him from suicide or from despair, from a difficult life. My cousin's response was, Van Gogh's art didn't fail Van Gogh. The people around Van Gogh failed Van Gogh. That was kind of a perspective that I wasn't previously embracing, but it seemed of interest. But by the way, in terms of that situation with Van Gogh, what was always of interest to me is the degree to which artists famously have committed suicide. There are lots of examples of famous artists, Rothko, Van Gogh, others, who suffered that fate. Philosophers in general do not. The examples of philosophers committing suicide are, well, Socrates and Seneca, where they were living in cultures where that was sanctioned. But philosophers in general have been more of the attitude expressed by Thales, who articulated maybe the first joke that we know of in the history of philosophy. Thales would say, life is no different than death. And people would say to him, then why don't you die? And his response, because it makes no difference. That actually is it's not so much a philosophical statement as a religious statement, in the sense that we cannot know that life is no different than death. But it's a kind of consolation that was in fact the consolation of Michelangelo. Michelangelo would say to himself, this world is of such beauty, I cannot imagine a next world being any less so if it was created by the same hand. And the reason that I bring up Michelangelo aside from that is Michelangelo had a method of working. He was considered the greatest monumental sculptor of the Renaissance, the greatest monumental painter of the Renaissance, the greatest architect of the Renaissance, the greatest poet of the Renaissance. But he was primarily a sculptor. That was sort of what governed his thinking about the art that he was doing in whatever medium, even when he was writing. And Michelangelo's approach to sculpture was that of removal, taking things away to reveal and ultimately achieve the form, the object that he was aiming for. So for example, he would start with a block, of marble, and the sculptural process would be to remove material until, as he saw it, the form within revealed itself, emerged. So his creative process was a matter of removal until he got to the form, the reality he desired. Philosophy, in its pursuit of rigor, works in a similar fashion. There's a Hindu admonition, actually a Buddhist admonition I mentioned last time. Don't seek reality, seek to put an end to opinion. Well, it's opinion that's non-rigorous. When you eliminate all the opinion, from your perspective, what you end up with is the rock foundation, the rock bottom foundation of rigor. That's the reality that philosophy is seeking. It's the type of reality that we are seeking educationally. But in terms of education, what I wanted to focus on in particular is what motivates and makes possible self-education. There are lots of examples historically. Last week I was talking about Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer went to Harvard. He spent his time at Harvard not so much in classes, but in the library, reading. The same thing was true of Thoreau, the American philosopher. The same thing of the American writer Thomas Wolfe. I did the same, in the sense that when I was at Harvard, they had what was considered the best philosophy department in the world. And it was an opportunity to experience, what the best sort of philosophical minds living had to offer. But those philosophical minds were not at the level, the historical level of Aristotle or Plato or Kierkegaard or Kant or Wittgenstein. Those individuals tended to emerge once a century or even less frequently. So given the opportunity to learn from the professors at Harvard or to learn from Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein, I chose the latter. So I would spend, actually, this was my practice even before I arrived at college. I was reading through the Western philosophical tradition out of my own interest and for my own benefit. And I was coming into contact through that process with the best minds that history had to offer. Not the best minds at a contemporary university, but the best minds throughout the history of Western culture, or the best minds throughout the history of Indian civilization or Chinese civilization. That's what drew me. The effort, though, of that kind of self-directed study has to be motivated, right? And it has to be motivated by a couple of considerations. First of all, what's the most important motive force behind any sort of educational drive or educational undertaking is curiosity. The philosopher and mathematician Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, from Harvard and Cambridge in the early part of the 20th century, once made the comment, curiosity may have killed the cat, but it's the lifeblood of the sciences. There's a movie that illustrates something of the nature and the significance of curiosity. It's a comedy by an American director, Albert Brooks. The title of the film is Defending Your Life. It came out maybe 25 years ago. It's a fantasy about someone who dies in a car accident and goes to what's called Judgment City, where he's going to be processed and evaluated for the afterlife. If he's demonstrated sufficient bravery, he moves on, moves forward. If he hasn't in his life, he has to go back and revisit life on Earth until he summons the courage to move forward. The premise of the film is that the the ultimate ambition, of human beings is to overcome fear. And that's what holds people back. Well, when he arrives at what's called Judgment City, where he's going to be evaluated, he's in a tram. It's almost like the city looks a little bit like Disneyland when he first arrives. And there's a tram that's taking the newly dead to their hotels where they're going to await their trials, their evaluations. And on the tram, there's Albert Brooks, who plays the main character in the film, is seated, and behind him is an old woman who's died a natural death. Most of the people around him are older. And at some point in the tram, she leans forward and says to him, "What do you think of this?" And Brooks replies, "I don't know what this is yet." Well, the simple fact of the matter is, we don't know what this is yet. We don't know the nature of these circumstances broadly or deeply or generally. Now, one of the reasons that we don't is because, as I again said last week, the future decides the past. If future experience is sufficiently radically different from past experience, it can change our judgment, our sense of what this was. And so the future reveals the nature of our circumstances. We can't yet know that. The reason that we don't have the kind of wonder typically in our eyes that would be appropriate for that type of understanding, that type of realization, is that we are almost dulled by familiarity, that objects, any two things, are approximately the same for some specific purpose or purposes, but rigorously different. When we sort of focus on, from a distance, like the approximate similarities, then we see things repeating themselves over and over again. When we focus on the specificities, the complete description in detail of every object or every moment, then we're struck more by the novelty. And that novelty is what can awaken us to a sense of wonder. And that sense of wonder is what can help motivate curiosity to explore. Now, I want to give you some concrete instances of how self-education can work and how it can be motivating. When I was a teenager, I didn't have much experience with music. I didn't come from a musical family. My parents liked big band music, of the 1930s and 40s, which I wasn't particularly drawn to. And I spend most of my time reading, not listening to music. I played the clarinet for a time because I had to as part of a school curriculum, but it wasn't anything that I was passionately connected to. And I didn't pursue it with any great sort of interest or determination. Well, I think it was 1968, actually, Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey premiered. Stanley Kubrick probably still ranks as the greatest American director and arguably the greatest of all directors in a lot of people's estimation. He achieved a level of precision in his films that we have not seen elsewhere. A level of precision that actually rises to the level in film of Vermeer in painting. And Vermeer is often considered the greatest painter of the Western tradition. Well, one of the noteworthy things about Kubrick's films, and especially beginning with 2001, was the soundtrack. The great director really in commercial circles in Hollywood that preceded Kubrick was Hitchcock, Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock used sound, music effectively, but basically to advance the plot. In the case of a Kubrick, in the case of a Hitchcock film, if it's a horror film, there will be disturbing music. So the music had the same tone as the film and reinforced the scenes, reinforced the movie. So there was a harmony, a concordance between the soundtrack of the film and the story that was being told. In the case of Kubrick, there was a radical divergence between the two. The soundtrack music that Kubrick selected was often classical, and it was often classical that seemed to run independently of the film itself. So in 2001, there's a famous moment where Kubrick uses Johann Strauss's The Blue Danube Waltz. He uses famously to open and close the film a piece by Richard Strauss, a late 19th century German composer, Also sprach Zarathustra, which is actually the title of a book by the German philosopher Nietzsche, maybe Nietzsche's greatest work. Well, I saw that movie, and that was really my first encounter with classical music. The piece by Strauss, the piece by Richard Strauss. And I was intrigued. I was not captivated, but I was intrigued. I didn't have the background to know a lot about where that music placed or what it meant in terms of a development of the art form, but I was kind of interested. The other thing that spawned was an interest in great composers that I had heard about, but really didn't have an appreciation of, hadn't listened to the music of, and knew virtually nothing about. Composers like Mozart, Beethoven, Bach. And what I said to myself at that point, that became one of the guiding inspirations for self-education and self-exploration was, the question I asked myself is, I hear these names, Mozart, Beethoven. I know that they're celebrated. I know that people make a fuss about them. My question was, out of curiosity, why? What is it that people are responding to in these individuals that I've had no exposure to, no experience of? Now, I wasn't sure that I was going to end up liking their music, but I felt that the fact that they were celebrated in the way that they were meant that it was something to investigate. It was something to try to come to terms with. And again, not from the standpoint of, could I fall in love with their music, but could I understand what it was about them, about their work, that made such an impression upon so many other people. That became my motivation. So what I did was, and this was, again, some years ago, before the internet, before we have the resources to do the kind of self-education that I did with a little bit more difficulty when I was younger. We had a radio station. I lived in Los Angeles, a radio station that played classical music 24 hours, one station. I also had a set of the Encyclopedia Britannica that my parents had bought me when I was 11 or 12, and was one of my main sources of self-education. I would randomly, when starting at the age of 11 or 12, read through the Encyclopedia Britannica. And at that time, it was the most authoritative reference work in the world. It was, I think, 24 volumes. And the articles in it on whatever subject were written by experts in the field, unedited. So Sigmund Freud, I think, wrote the article on psychoanalysis. Einstein might have written an article. The actual creators, wrote articles, and many of them were sophisticated because they didn't have to be edited for any type of general audience. The creators, the writers, the contributors were allowed to write to their audience, whatever form that took. So some of these pieces were very sophisticated, some less so, but that itself became an extraordinarily effective mental training, because at a young age, I was exposed to difficult material that forced me to elevate my mental acuity, to try to come to terms with it. And even if I couldn't come to terms with some of these writings, at a level that I would subsequently be able to, it was like working out with weights, where you're doing something that's hard, and that's harder than you might have to do for some sport that you might be playing. But because of the difficulty of the preparation, the actual sport itself becomes easier. So starting reading sophisticated things at a relatively young age made it easier for me to encounter difficult material and assimilate it later on. Well, so I made a practice of listening to a piece of music on the radio, whatever piece they played. I had no control over it. And then whatever the piece was, whoever composed it, I'd go to the encyclopedia and I'd read the article on that person. And in some cases, the articles were long, and anytime I would hear that composer repeatedly, I would go back and reread the piece. I did that for Mozart, I did that for Beethoven. Over time, I began to develop a sense of discrimination. I began to notice the distinctions between different composers, different styles of music. I began to respond differentially. Here we were dealing with difference again. I began to respond more favorably to Mozart than to Bach. And so by that kind of self-educated process, I acquainted myself with the history of Western classical music. And I began to appreciate it, began to understand what these people had done that was responsible for the kind of acclaim they received. Now, I did not end up liking or responding to everybody equally. I never have liked Bach as much as Mozart or Beethoven, for example. But it reached the point where I love the music of Mozart. And by love, I mean to achieve strong emotional responses. And by strong emotional responses, I mean to some passages, some sections, some things, chills and tears. Chills and tears, strong emotional reaction. Once I developed a strong emotional reaction to something, that told me that I was onto something, that I was suddenly now, I had gained access to something about the nature of that person's work that was likely responsible for the reputation that that person enjoyed. Now, to show you the kind of lessons that one can extract from that kind of experience. In the course of reading these, reading through these, the lives and these articles about these composers, I would go back mostly to Mozart, because he was the composer that I found most compelling, most captivating. The articles in the Britannica had references at the end of them. The Mozart article had a short bibliography. The first book listed in the Mozart bibliography at the end of the article in the Britannica on Mozart was by A. Einstein. Mozart, his character, his work, 1947. Well, I mentioned Einstein last week. I'd been studying Einstein's work, reading biographies of Einstein from a young age. I knew that Einstein died in 1955, that most of his work, the work for which he's most celebrated, had been done early in his life. Like the work on the theory of relativity was published when he was 26. His general theory of relativity was completed when he was 39. So the last decades of his life were not marked by a lot of major scientific accomplishments or contributions. So I knew that he had time, to do other things. I also knew that he had a passion for the violin. He played the violin religiously. And I knew that his favorite composer was Mozart. He would play Mozart on the violin on a regular basis, and it was his relaxation, but also his mental stimulation, because music is highly mathematical in its structure, and he found that listening, especially to the music of Mozart, helped him think. We've seen, like in more recent years, studies done where infants seem to benefit cognitively, by listening, in particular to Mozart. It's called the Mozart Effect. It's something that I can appreciate. I understand, and I feel strongly enough about Mozart to appreciate, how that effect might in fact be real. But I was ecstatic when I saw that Einstein had written a biography and a study of Mozart. And I figured, given the nature of Einstein's intelligence and sensibility and insight, it would be probably as valuable a book to read about Mozart as I was likely to encounter. So we had a local bookstore in those days. Again, this is before the internet was even invented. And I called up the bookstore and I ordered the book, Mozart, His Character's Work. It took a couple of weeks. I drove to the bookstore when I got a call that the book had arrived, and it came in like just a brown package. It's like papered over in brown. I arrive, I open the package, and there is the book, Mozart, His Character, His Work, Alfred Einstein. Well, it turns out A. Einstein, 1947, was not Albert Einstein. It was Alfred, someone completely unrelated, who happened to be a famous musicologist, a famous writer on the lives and the work of composers, in particular Mozart. I had never heard of him before. I was stunned. I had never been, I was so confident. It was so obvious it had to be the work of Albert that it never even crossed my mind. It was like being hit over the head with a realization. And the lesson I learned from that encounter was actually more important for doing philosophy than any of the experiences that I had in coming to terms with the Western musical tradition, namely the lesson of presumption, of never being overly confident when you're dealing with something of which you cannot be certain. So there's an aphorism that I've written. Well, I use this word presumption or presume. We presume more than we know, as if there were no time. I can express all of my sort of philosophical results in terms of a commentary on the issue, the problem, the tendency to presumption that is rigorously unjustifiable. So that experience of exploring the Western musical tradition introduced me to the most important lesson, that one can encounter in an educational setting. Don't presume more than you know. Now, there's a follow-up to that story. And the idea was, even though there are all these elements that came together suggesting that the A. Einstein was Albert Einstein, it wasn't rigorous. It wasn't an incontrovertible conclusion. When you're dealing with anything outside the realm of philosophy, you're dealing with possibility. You're dealing with what I call heuristics. Anything that's not certain in that rigorous philosophical sense is heuristic. It's something that serves some purpose, can help achieve some goal, but it cannot do so incontestably rigorously. In other words, anything that's not purely rigorously philosophical is something that we can never be absolutely sure about. And that includes any of the propositions within the sciences. And we talked about that last time too, that science is based upon the process of controlled experimentation, comparing two objects, one that's the control, the other is the experimental object. But the reason that experimentation in science is not rigorous is the world is different in different directions. And so the object here is in a different environment than the object here. And that environmental difference can be responsible for any difference that arises in the course of the experiment. And that's true for any two objects. Any difference between two objects, which can simply be what allows us to recognize that they are two and not one, means that whatever rigorously applies to one need not rigorously apply to the other. So science operates in a non-rigorous space. Most of any claim outside the philosophic that we are committed to is a presumptive claim, something that we can entertain for the time being. We can use it. We can move in the direction of it, but we can't ever fully, completely, rigorously validate it. And that was my sort of experience with that. Now, there's a related story I wanted to tell that goes in the opposite direction. When I was in medical school, there was someone in our class by the name of Tom Einstein. And because my last name is Friedman, he happened to sit next to me, where we were sitting alphabetically, in the first class we had in medical school, which was histology, microbiology. We had like desks that we would share with another person. Each of us had our microscope on the desk, these large microscopes, and he would sit next to me and we would converse. He was earnest. He was not exceptionally academically gifted in that environment. He didn't, but he was dedicated and he was committed, to a medical career. The first week in medical school, when it became known that there was a Tom Einstein in the class who happened to have blonde hair and who happened to have parents who were from Switzerland, people thought, could this person be related to Albert Einstein? And of course, people would go to him and ask, do you happen to be, a relative? And no, it just, and it was easy to accept that he wasn't related to Albert Einstein. If there was one family of Einsteins from Switzerland, there could be many. So it was just dropped, and it was never really pursued beyond that initial week when people kind of asked that question of him. Well, the semester proceeded, and at some point in histology, in microbiology, we were studying the eye. And there's physics, obviously, associated with the eye, optics, physics of light and the bending of light, by the eye. And I had a conversation with him one day, and about the nature of the eye and the nature of our vision and the nature of the processing of light by the eye. And I don't remember exactly what it was, but he made a comment about that, a comment about the physics of the eye. And even though I don't remember the comment itself, what I do remember was it was strange. There was something about the comment that was coming from a totally different direction than anything I had heard or thought. There was a a novelty of perspective that was striking. At that moment, I knew that this person was closely related to Albert Einstein. Now, it turns out that because of Albert Einstein's fame, he did not want anyone to know. I happened to be friends with the financial aid director at the school, who was one of a small group of people that knew the backstory of all of the students. And I went to her and I told her, you know, that there's something odd about that comment. I think this is a direct descendant of Albert Einstein. And in fact, I was right. He was Einstein's grandson. So there's presumption where you rush to conclusions prematurely. But then there's also one, in the course of one's education, wants to be attuned to those elements that are sufficiently striking that one knows they have a deeper significance. That type of being struck by is often also something that can guide us strongly forward. An example of that is when I was going through like my high school years, I was mostly reading science and philosophy and nonfiction. I was not reading a lot of literature. I'd read some plays by Shakespeare because they were assigned, but I was not in love with any real sort of author of plays or novels. That was not the direction of my interest. But then I went to England one summer. Turns out my mother was English, and she came from a large family that lived in London. So it was possible one year to go over to London and spend 3 months living with an uncle of mine. The first week I arrived, I was sitting at the dining room table reading through some magazines that they were receiving. What I noticed in these English magazines is that they were often illustrated by the ads in these magazines were often accompanied by quotations by famous English writers. English is one of the rich literatures, and England is proud of its authors. The authors that were most commonly quoted were Shakespeare and Samuel Johnson. Shakespeare, obviously the greatest writer in the language of any type. Samuel Johnson considered the greatest English man of letters, the greatest literary critic within the history of the language. One day, again during the first week, I opened to a perfume ad. And the perfume ad was accompanied by a quotation from Shakespeare, from Shakespeare's King Lear, a late play. The same play that gave us that line that I did talk about last week too, "I'll teach you differences," that line. Well, the line though that was used in this perfume ad was, "Her voice was ever soft, gentle, and low, an excellent thing in woman." It was an epitaph to Cordelia, the king's daughter, who had been killed in the course of the play. My mother had a similar type of voice, and I've sometimes written about the effect that my mother's voice had, on me when I was young. So there was a connection, partly because of that connection, but also partly because of the sound of the line. Her voice was the S's and the L's of the line. And her voice was ever soft, gentle, and low, an excellent thing. Just the music of that line struck me. And I thought to myself, in a way that no line of English poetry or literature, prose, had ever struck me before. And I said to myself, my goodness, anything that contains a line so beautiful must be worth reading. So the next day, I go to a famous bookstore that I don't think any longer exists in London called Foyles, that had an enormous collection of books. And again, these are in the days before everything, so much is available online. And I went and I bought a copy of King Lear and I read through it. And I proceeded from that point to read through all of Shakespeare's plays. And then I proceeded to systematically read through all the major authors of English literature, starting with Chaucer, going through Spencer, the Renaissance poets and writers, all the way up through basically the 20th century. And it was all self-directed. And it was all self-directed and motivated by that line of Shakespeare that became, for me, the touchstone. That's the kind of thing that whenever it appears, whenever you encounter, such a line or such an experience or such a response, you want to take it seriously and you want to pursue it. And you want to use that as an opening into a realm, of material that you can pursue and expose yourself to with the possibility of similar responses. That's the kind of thing that has guided, again, my continuing effort to master subjects. Another example of how this works, at least for me, and how I would recommend, some of these processes, to others. In college, I would enroll in courses that I was interested in, whatever the subject. There might be history, it might be philosophy, it might be art history. I would enroll in a course based on my potential interest in the subject. Usually I would take courses that I knew something about, and so had reason to enroll in the course. I knew that this was an area that I was interested in and want to know more about. And often I was drawn to the course because of the reading list. Well, somehow for me, once I was in the course, once I was committed to that reading list, I would often not do any further work for the course. I was in the course, so now my interest was no longer that course, it was other subjects, other things. So in college, actually, I spent a lot of my time, like I mentioned earlier, in the library reading on my own, and in bookstores on campus, reading randomly on my own. I would literally read whole books, just standing in bookstores, typically having no relation to the courses that I had enrolled in out of my initial interest in that subject. So I ended up getting a substantial education, but again, self-directed in a totally different direction from the courses that I was supposed to be taking. Okay, well, invariably, I would find myself at the end of the semester facing final exams, and often not having read anything in the course. So it might be a few nights before the final. In some cases, it was the night before the final exam. It might be a history course. One course in particular was the history of the Italian Renaissance, something that I was interested in, but once I was enrolled in the course, suddenly I wasn't interested. I wanted to read other things. So again, this is one example among many where it might have been 9 o'clock at night. I had the final exam in the course the next morning at like 9 a.m. and I hadn't done any reading the entire semester for the course. Okay? I had to motivate myself. And what I would say to myself was, okay, look, people have spent their lives on whatever the subject is. People have spent their lives, studying the Italian Renaissance, writing books about the Italian Renaissance, writing the books that you've been assigned to read. They've devoted their lives to teaching the subject, to exploring it, they themselves have been as compelled or have found that subject as compelling as I find philosophy. Well, Now, we hear this a lot historically. People like Mark Twain emphasize that, you know, each person is all people, right? That's not a rigorous statement, but it's something that has heuristic value. It can guide us in a direction outside ourselves. So I would, in those situations where I was facing having to read an entire coursework in one night, I knew that wasn't possible. I knew it wasn't possible to really assimilate all this material, but I would say to myself, if some people out there found this subject of sufficient interest to devote a lifetime to, there might be something in that subject that I can find interesting, valuable, compelling for the next 10 hours. So with that in mind, I would change my orientation. I would stop thinking of myself as a scientist, you know, studying molecular biology, or as a philosopher studying philosophy, or as maybe I was starting to do some art in those days. And I would think of myself as, what would it be like to be the author of a book on the Renaissance? Try to put myself in the position of somebody for whom that subject was the ultimate pursuit. In other words, I would almost try to do it as an actor, adopting a role where the role was Italian Renaissance devotee, Italian Renaissance professor, someone who was going from this point forward to spend their lifetime, perhaps, pursuing a doctorate and then a teaching career in Italian Renaissance studies. In other words, I would put myself into the role of somebody for whom that subject was their life. And I found it possible to do that. In other words, what I always tell people is, whatever subject you're encountering, let's say a subject in school that you're required to encounter, that you're required to study and seek mastery in, don't fight yourself. Don't say, I'm not interested, but I'll do it anyway. Generate the interest, and generate the interest like an actor would in a role where that subject becomes, for 5 hours or 10 hours or whatever period of time, your world. And see if there aren't aspects of that subject that you can't find inherently of interest. And there always are. I mean, there's enough commonality, you know, in human experience that we can generate and find that interest. Without doing that, I would never have succeeded. But having done that repeatedly, I always ended up succeeding. I mean, I tell people when they're taking exams, like standardized tests, like in this country, we have the SAT for getting into college, right? So if you're going to an American university, you would take an entrance exam like the SAT. The SAT has reading passages on it, passages from random subjects that they ask questions about to test your reading comprehension. I tell people, when you're taking these exams, read these passages as if you're reading a magazine that you're inherently interested in. If you have a favorite magazine that you would want to be reading through, imagine that you're reading these passages as if these were your favorite subjects. Read them not to answer questions and not to just do well enough on the exam, but read them to learn from. Read them as if you care. And even if you don't care, generate the interest, like I said previously, where you're a human being, other human beings have devoted their lifetime to these things. You can find enough interest to devote 5 minutes to reading this, not because it's an obligation, but because it's an opportunity. And the opportunity is always like the opportunity that I had when I listened to classical music on the radio, the opportunity to respond strongly to a piece by Mozart, the opportunity when I went to England to open up the page of a magazine to a perfume ad and respond strongly to a line from Shakespeare. You're looking for those opportunities, and you're not fleeing from them or running from them. You're running in the direction of them. You're trying to take advantage of them. Yes. So there is, as I said, now, in terms of how the kind of the mastery that you might want to sort of advance is achieved, well, on the one hand, philosophy talks about rigor, talks about distinction and difference. You know, that whatever distinction there is between you and everything else is the basis for your existing at all. But outside that realm of philosophy, every object that we encounter is some type of what I call convergence. If the philosophic space of rigor, of what's incontestable, is, as I designated, an epistemic space, things that are absolutely incontestable. And examples of that are the past can't guarantee the future decides the past, or 2 points are not equal to 1. You know, propositions like that, incontestable. Everything else, everything that we in fact see or encounter is part of heuristic space and is a convergence. And what I mean by convergence is, if you look around and you see objects, you see a table, a chair, what those encounters are, what you're observing is a convergence, a coming together of past experiences. You've had past experiences with things that resemble that chair, that resemble that table. Your mind is able to categorize it as such, and based upon all of your past experiences with it, you have a sense of what that is, which amounts to how it's going to behave, what you're going to experience if you move towards it, what you're going to experience if you sit down on it, what you're going to experience in terms of the properties of a physical object. All of these things that we're encountering around us are convergences of lots of individual elements coming together. They might be elements of sensation. When you look at a chair, you can describe it in terms of colors, of shapes. Those are things, again, numbers of different things coming together to form an ordered object. Everything that is not philosophical is the nature of some convergence. Every object we encounter, every goal that we have, every enterprise that we are trying to undertake and achieve a result from is achieved through some type of convergent process. Here's what I mean. Let's say you want to get into a castle, okay? You want to storm a castle. Well, you can storm the castle if you have a key. A key is a convergent element. It's something where all of the facets of the key, the sides, the edges, have to come together in just the right way. It has to be engineered in just the right way. Processes of manufacturing are processes where things are done in a certain sequence to achieve a certain highly ordered result. That's one way of getting into a castle. If you kind of craft this key that can just fit the lock. Another way to do it is through sufficient numbers. You can storm the castle if you have enough troops. And if you don't have enough troops to storm the castle, you can, in ultimately storm it by assembling enough. There is some in heuristic space, in the space of goals, in the space of objects, there is some number of convergent elements, some number of things we can put together that in principle will achieve a result. Now, we can't know that rigorously by definition. The only things that we can know rigorously are philosophic propositions. Here we're talking about things in the world that are not purely philosophic. The idea is, let's say that we want to break down a door, okay? Well, to break down a door, we can use a battering ram, right? At some point, we might begin to use the battering ram and it may not break down the door. If it doesn't break down the door, what do? We continue to batter it. Each additional battering of the door is an additional convergent element. There are some number of batterings that will break down that door. If the door doesn't break down after 100 or 1,000, such attempts, what can we do? We can bring some other elements to converge upon the problem. We can bring dynamite. We can bring various kinds of even more powerful explosives. There is some number of elements that in principle we can bring together to achieve a result. That's, again, true for everything that we are interested in achieving. Some number of repetitions. And remember, I don't think I talked about this last time, but there's that famous saying, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different result. That's a popular definition. It's not correct. And the reason it's not a correct and useful kind of proposition is you can't do the same thing repeatedly. Every time you use a battering ram against a door, the history of that encounter is different. Every time you apply the battering ram, it's not any longer quite the same. It's not the same application. It's different, if only for the fact that there was one now additional element in the history of the encounter. Instead of this being the 100th application, it's the 101st, the 102nd. And at some point, you will reach a threshold of sufficiency to achieve the result you want. Now, you say to yourself, well, is that absolutely true? Can you always know in advance that enough batterings will get through the door? And the answer is no, you can't know rigorously, because again, we're dealing with a non-rigorous space. There's no way to know in principle that some result will be achieved, but at the same time, there's no way to know that it won't with a sufficient number of elements applied. That's ultimately the principle behind the Winston Churchill proclamation: never, never, never surrender, never, ever, ever give up. The notion behind that is that some number of applications, some set of ingredients, some additional effort or additional time or additional attempts will, in principle, have the ability to achieve a result in heuristic space. If you are interested in mastering a language, it's a matter of repetition, or it's a matter of adding convergent elements. You will read more books in the language. You will read more grammar books in the language. You will listen to more radio broadcasts, or watch more films, or have more conversations, or repeat things to yourself more times. What we're talking about simply is the nature of the logic of heuristic space, where we're trying to achieve a goal. A goal is an object. An object is a convergence of elements, different elements coming together. The nature of an artwork is elements coming together. It's been said that the most important innovation in art in the entire 20th century, which was a century of robust achievement in the arts, as robust as any previous century, it said that the most important single development in 20th century art was the collage. The collage was invented, the first collage was done by Picasso in, God, I think around 1911 or so. He put a piece of caning, of a component of a chair onto a painting. So it became the first time where radically different materials were conjoined, were added together to make a work. That's an illustration of convergence. Every creative process is simply a matter of adding elements together. That is the key to self-education. You want to achieve a result, you have to just expose yourself to enough convergent elements. If you're trying to achieve mastery, it's a matter of doing something a sufficient number of times or approaching something from a sufficient number of different directions. And again, if you say, well, can I be sure I'm going to get the result? My answer is, well, you cannot be sure of anything in heuristic space. And there's a deep reason for that. And the deep reason for that is every circumstance is a little bit different. Every effort that you make is against a slightly different background. Every individual's experience is slightly different than every other's. Every set of circumstances from moment to moment is slightly different than whatever has come before. And since rigor is a difference, any difference means that you cannot be rigorously sure that you'll achieve a result. You don't need to be. In heuristic space, all you need to know is a sufficient number of elements put together can, in principle, achieve the result. And if you haven't achieved it yet, it means you haven't applied sufficient number of convergent elements. There's a famous fairy tale, actually, story, written by Václav Havel, who was the first president of the Czech Republic. Václav Havel wrote of a boy who relentlessly banged his head against the wall. And everyone thought him mad, banging his head against the wall, for no good purpose. Until one day, after some considerable length of time, the wall comes down. Okay? That's, again, a refutation of the idea that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is insanity. No, the little boy was thought to be insane, but every time he hit his head against the wall was slightly different than it was the previous time, and slightly weaker, even if it's infinitesimally weaker. And eventually, those weaknesses add up to a rupture. And eventually the wall comes down. It's obviously a metaphor of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's the notion of perseverance, right? There's a famous story coming from out of Silicon Valley. Actually, there are two. One is an admonition. Just when you're at the point of giving up, in some enterprise, in some effort again of achieving mastery, some enterprise of self-education. Just when you're at the point of giving up, the point of frustration to the point of accepting failure, that's when you're almost there. Now again, is that rigorous? No. Can't be rigorous. It's a heuristic proposition operating in a situation where every circumstance is a little different. It can't be rigorous, but it's a guiding principle. And it's a guiding principle for mastery. the other famous sort of anecdote coming out of Silicon Valley or out of that tech world is the number 242. It's a lot of people's favorite number in that kind of entrepreneurial community, in the entrepreneurial world, 242. What that number is the number of rejections the founder of Starbucks received from venture capitalists, people he was going to try to raise money for Starbucks, one of the world's now most successful corporations, the number of rejections he received before number 243 said yes. 242 rejections. You have to ask yourself, how many people would have given up after 15, after 20, after 200? That's, again, you would say, if we were going by that proposition, doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different result is insanity, he was insane. But he wasn't insane because each time he approached a new venture capitalist, a new person from whom to try to raise funds, he was different. The venture capitalist was different. He had now more cumulative experience of what might work, of what to say, of what not to say. Things are only ever approximately the same, but they are rigorously different. And that applies to everything. And that applies to every one of our efforts. And that's enough to argue against prematurely giving up, ever giving up. Because the simple fact of the matter is the circumstances are always different. Maybe slightly different, but different enough. That continual application will inevitably, heuristically, effectively make a difference. And that difference ultimately can be the decisive difference that you're trying to achieve. Okay. How are we doing? I think it's, yes. So is there something else I wanted to deal with here? Oh, yeah, let me make a final comment on that. And that is, one of the things that creative individuals have in general practiced is don't rush to premature conclusions. Give things time. People like Einstein, Newton, Poincaré, even Hitler would encounter a situation, absorb relevant information, and then allow things to incubate. Einstein incubated his ideas about the theory of relativity for about 15 years before it emerged in a final form. Somebody like Freud, the psychoanalyst, tended to rush to conclusions. Freud's work has not stood up effectively. When I was in medical school, when I was doing some psychiatry in medical school, Freud's name was never mentioned because Freud prematurely rushed to solutions. You have to give things time. And over time, things can come together and you can achieve the kind of result that you're aiming for. Okay, is that?
Thank you very much, Mr. Friedman, for this interesting speech. Like every time you say a sentence, it's a lot of new information which we learn from you. And yeah, I actually have a lot of questions, but unfortunately, time is limited.
You have limited time. See, I didn't notice the time, but okay, yes. Should we? Do we have time for any questions?
We still have 5 minutes, and if our participants have questions, please welcome. You can unmute yourself and just ask anything. If there are none, like I would ask the question regarding the efficient, what is more efficient, to do something repeatedly, every time each other the same things, or apply like different means and see other results?
They're both effective, and you can't know in advance. And literally, now I do both. Literally, I do both. I think there's some value in revisiting subjects. Like, for example, I teach a lot of subjects. I tutor, like one-on-one, and I've taught algebra, like, you know, basic algebra, hundreds of times. But every time I encounter it, I learn something. I see something new. So there's benefit in repetition. There's also benefit in seeing. I recommend both. And I recommend both in different degrees and to different amounts. Sometimes, you know, do 5 repetitions and then vary things in the next time. The same thing applies actually to things like treatment within medicine, treatment of cancers. Like what should be the sequence in which you give chemotherapy? Like how should you vary it? It's like you should keep certain things the same, try certain things over and over, vary other things. There's no way of knowing in advance. And there's no way of knowing in advance for any particular problem. You just, it's like somebody might have said to the founder of Starbucks, you need to go in a different direction. You know, you might achieve success in a different direction. And he might have. But again, the point is we can't ever, and we can talk about this more next week, do the kinds of comparisons that can tell you whether it would have been better to do one than the other. What matters is that you're doing more of anything. So it can be more of the same thing, more of different things. In any given situation, they're both equally likely to give you a valuable result. You can't know in advance.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Right?
And also, like the related question is, have you ever procrastinated? Like, how do you deal with the procrastination?
Well, okay. I will tell you this though, because there's a saying that I like by the German philosopher and writer Goethe, Goethe. Goethe was a 19th century German writer and philosopher. He's most famous for a play, Faust, but he was considered the Shakespeare of Germany, the greatest writer in the history of German culture. Okay? And Goethe said, if you would be happy, you must do your duty. And what is your duty? The demand of the hour. So I procrastinate always, but I try to remind myself that I will be happier if I don't, because I will be happier if I do what I am supposed to do right then and there. Then I will be released from the burden of having that on my mind. So I find that particular saying, if you would be happy, you must do your duty. And what is your duty? The demand of the hour. So I find that is something, but no, I procrastinate on a daily basis still. So, but when I'm procrastinating, other things are happening, right? And you can also say to yourself that there can be fruitful reasons for the procrastination. That while you're procrastinating, you might get ideas that help you achieve the goal that, you know, the project that you're procrastinating is aiming for. So again, you can't know in advance, but that saying by Goethe, I find helpful. You know, and I do feel better always. That's been my experience attending, but nevertheless, I think a little bit of procrastination is good. And the reason is because it gives you time for ideas to come together. You know, often when you're procrastinating, you might not be ready to do something as effectively as you might be given a little bit more time. Like I always find that, like I'm always procrastinating about preparing for these talks. Like, what am I going to say? But as I'm procrastinating, I'm getting new ideas. So I find that even procrastination, you know, can be beneficial as long as it's kind of a convergent element in the effort to achieve a goal.
Yes, thank you for the answers and for this interesting quote from Goethe. It's indeed like inspiring, and I think it is indeed like pushing when we see a goal and we know that after achieving this goal we will feel ourselves better.
Yes,
so it's
absolutely.
time to do.
Yes, always better. Yes, yes, and it's and as I said, it's you can play games with yourself, right? Like what I when I'm like when I you kind of try to sort of see the activity that you're supposed to be engaged in, that you're putting off, as benefiting you in some way, or just if you take, the point is that it's helpful not to fight against whatever it is that you have an opportunity to do. You want to see whatever activity you're supposed to be kind of pursuing as an opportunity that might lead to something of greater benefit. And that might, I mean, I always find that the more exposure I have to something, the more time I spend with something, the more I begin to appreciate it, the more I understand something about it that I didn't previously. And so you want to see all of these encounters and responsibilities as opportunities. The philosopher Wittgenstein once had a friend who was in World War II in the Navy, a student. And the student was complaining about World War II, the war being boring, because oftentimes when you're at war, you're not doing anything, you're not fighting, you're waiting to fight. So he found it boring. And Wittgenstein's response was, if you paid enough attention, it would not be so boring. If you looked more closely, if you engaged more, if you became more aware, of what you're experiencing, of the opportunities, that are being presented, even in a task, that you will learn from. I mean, there's something about having to do something that can be a burden, but at the same time, it's an opportunity for a level of mastery, achieving a level of mastery that you haven't previously. So you have to see a lot of these things, again, as opportunities that might lead to something unexpected. That's the nature, partly, of this space. There's something unique about every moment. So there's uniqueness that each engagement, each effort, sort of offers. And it can lead to unexpected results. So you want to be sort of aware of the unexpected, and you want to be sufficiently attentive to detail so that everything is presenting you with something new, something different that you can be engaged by and learn from. But it takes attention to detail.
Yes, very, very interesting and very useful and helpful to know. So I very hope that our participants also learned a lot from this session, and we invite everybody for the next meeting, the same time, the same Friday, next Friday. And thank you very much, Mr. Friedman, for joining us today and have this wonderful talk with us. We will wait for you next week. Have a wonderful,
yes, thank you.
Wonderful weekends, everyone, and see you next time.
Okay. Goodbye. Goodbye. Thank you so much again. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye. Good night. Good day. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.